earpiece, set it face down on the assigned spot. Also, while the microphone is live, please avoid, if you can, touching it to ensure that there is no sound popping that can be harmful to the translators. As well, a reminder again, speak slowly if you can, which benefits the translation. For those appearing virtually, this meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to House of Commons Standing Order. You have the option to speak and participate in the official language of your choice. Those in the room, you have interpretation services through your earpiece, and you can select which option you wish on the through the device. Those appearing virtually, refer to the bottom of your surface, click on the globe icon, and choose the official language of your choice. If there is a breakdown in translation, please get my attention. Those virtually, use the raised hand icon. Those in the room, simply raise your hand, and we'll suspend while it is being corrected. I would remind everyone to please address all comments and questions through I, the chair. Wait until I recognize you by name, and we will proceed as that. This morning's first hour, I would like to welcome our witnesses. We have this morning with us, we have one witness for the first roughly hour. From the Office of the Federal Housing Advocate, we have Madame Marie Jose Houlet, a Federal Housing Advocate. Madame, you have 5 minutes, please.
Great. Bonjour, je m'appelle Marie-Josée Houle, et en tant que...
Good morning, my name is Josée Houle, and as the Federal Defender of Housing, my role is to bring systemic action to ensure that Canada respects the fundamental right to adequate housing. So I'm here for accountability purposes for human rights.
For the invitation. I'm here today to find solutions. And to end this housing crisis, federal investments must support non-market housing. And here's why. So first, non-market housing is fundamental to upholding the right to housing. Second, investing in non-market housing is the best use of public money. And finally, the federal government has an obligation to lead. So to start, non-market housing is key to upholding the fundamental human right to housing. And Canada recognized the human right to housing in the 2019 National Housing Strategy Act. And today's systemic issues such as unaffordability and encampments happen because we don't treat housing as a human right and public good. And our research estimates that Canada is short 4.4 million affordable homes. Disadvantaged groups are overrepresented in core housing need and homelessness. This committee has heard a lot about supply. And, that supply is the answer. But it has to be the right supply, the supply that meets people's needs. And the way forward is non-market housing, cooperative, non-profit, public, and Indigenous housing that puts people and human rights first. So investing in non-market housing creates permanently affordable, accessible housing for a wide range of people, and it protects tenants from unaffordable rent increases and arbitrary evictions. And people have more money for food and medicine. So non-market housing benefits everyone because it's non-inflationary and it protects land and buildings from speculation. And the federal government stopped investing in non-market housing over 30 years ago, and the result is that Canada's housing supply is driven by investors. Instead, we must prioritize non-market housing supply and people's right to housing. Second, non-market housing is the best use of public money for public good. L'utilisation des fonds publics pour créer des incentives.
The use of public funds to create incentives with no conditions for the private sector is not the solution. That does not mean that the private market does not have its place. However, any investment of public funds must generate a public good.
It has proven it remains affordable in the long term. And according to a 2022 study, rents at co-ops stayed affordable over a period of nearly 20 years, ranging from 25 to 33% less than similar market rent apartments in the same city. So meanwhile, our research shows that nearly 30% of private rental buildings have been acquired by institutional investors, resulting in steep rent increases and high eviction rates. And the non-market sector provides the accountability governments need to effectively target their investments, and it has data on how many homes they provide and what they cost, and it accounts for government funding. It's governed by volunteer boards accountable to the community, and in contrast, the private market offers little data on housing outcomes, a lack of transparency around ownership and financialization, and it's accountable to their shareholders and to profits. So to ensure that public money is resulting in public good, we need better accountability for taxpayer money spent on housing. We need better data collection to measure long-term results. We need measurement of not just outputs of housing, but outcomes for people based in human rights. And we need to prioritize non-market housing. So finally, the federal government has an obligation to lead the way out of this housing crisis. And I know you can do it. Investir dans un système de logement qui...
Investing in a housing system that respects human rights is not simply smart, but also an obligation of the government under international law and the National Housing Strategy Act. Budget 2024 and the Housing Plan makes sure that there will be appreciable investments in housing, non-market housing, and we must make sure that in the long term, human rights are protected.
From the current 3.5% to 7%, and we must aim higher. Our research shows that we need a long-term target of 20% of all units dedicated to non-market housing. And lastly, it's not just about spending. We must support Canada's non-market sector, and that means new approaches to financing, governance, capacity building, and approvals so non-market providers can scale up, embracing community land trusts so that public lands can be used for development by non-market providers, and legislative change so that non-market providers can leverage their assets to build and acquire more properties. Federal investments must support a plan to grow non-market housing, and because when everyone in Canada has their right to housing upheld, Canada benefits. Our economy benefits, communities benefit, and people benefit. So thank you very much. Merci.
Merci, Madame Houle. Mr. Aitchison for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Houle, for being here, and thank you for the work you do. You just indicated that your analysis indicates that of our housing stock, upwards of 20% should be non-market housing. Is that fair? So that's an indication then that you do see a role for market housing in our system as well. You're not opposed to market housing. You just recognize that we need to have more non-market housing.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. And in terms of the impediments of getting that non-market housing constructed and people living in that non-market housing, I would assume you would agree that the cost to build is a big part of that problem.
Yep.
Costs.
Yep.
And those costs are driven by inflation, by government charges and fees at all levels.
Yep. Yep, and I've done some development myself over the past, about 15 years ago, so things have changed a lot.
So can you speak to the impact of local charges and fees and development approvals processes to the cost of getting not just market housing built, but non-market housing constructed as well, what that adds to the cost of these desperately needed safe homes?
When a proposal is created and for either to get government funds to build or to just put a proposal to be approved for city planning, the architect has put work up front, the contractor has put up front, and the developer has put up work up front. And then, so while you're waiting for approvals, these people haven't been paid, or if they have been paid, there's interest because your project isn't generating money through rents. So that has an impact. So the longer it's in that interim period, the more it costs money. And with the interest rates being higher, if you've heard from the private market as well as co-ops in the non-market housing sector that, it's having a huge impact. That being said, the municipal, so we've got the municipal governments that have an important role to play through zoning and planning powers. At the same time, during my review of encampments, I've heard over and over again that municipalities bear the brunt of the housing crisis, but lack the resources and powers to address the root causes. So there's no guarantee that savings from reduced development charges will be passed on to new residents. So that's one thing, whether they're home buyers, renters, or people living in non-market housing. So there, whatever municipalities or whatever incentives are in place, whether it's tax cuts or funds given, there has to be strings attached. Because, the development charges do play a really important role. And that's income to make sure that you have the housing-related infrastructure in municipalities and that they support non-market housing. So to just say we need to cut development charges, where are the municipalities going to make up that loss of funds for these really important things? So, it really comes down to the federal government and provincial governments. They have to take the lead and provide the resources municipalities need to end the housing crisis.
So if I can continue on with this train of thought, it sounds like you read some talking points from the FCM there, maybe, but I'm teasing you a little bit. Clearly, we need all levels of government going in the same direction. You're arguing that we all need to be heading in the same direction, and the cost of government overall is too high, and we can't make one level of government bear this burden solely on their own. Would that be a fair statement?
Oh, absolutely. We've seen too much finger pointing, saying this is terrible, but you need cohesion.
So, in the context of the latest federal programs, where there's multiple different funds and different programs that the federal government has enacted to support all kinds of different types of housing, to support other levels of government. One of them is the Housing Accelerator Fund, which is a $4 billion fund out of the entire group of funds that is being given to municipalities based on agreements with those municipalities to speed up the process. And so we've never seen the agreements. We don't know exactly how they're going to speed up, just that there's been reports that they will. In the context of the need of social housing, supportive housing, non-market housing, do you think it makes sense for any federal programs to be focused on helping municipalities, hire more bureaucrats or whatever they're going to do with that money? Or do you think that money would be better focused on the non-market side?
That's, I am not privy, like yourself, to these agreements, so I don't know that they are hiring more people, except that when I was doing a project...
So let's go back to the
Okay.
simple question without my
Okay.
preamble.
Okay.
In a housing crisis, does it make any sense for public dollars to be spent on anything but the need for non-market housing? In your mind?
No, because we need to bring up the percentage to at least 7% and be really ambitious to bring it up to 20.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Mr. Aitchison, Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins, for 6 minutes.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and welcome, Ms. Old, to the committee. Welcome back. I'll pick up where Mr. Aitchison left off. I've come from the municipal sector. I spent over 25 years as city councilor in the city of Hamilton, and many of those years I spent serving on our nonprofit housing authority, where we manage 7,000 affordable units. One of the things I complained about before I arrived, I was even very critical of our own government after the national housing strategy was released, because it was taking, in my mind, too long for the dollars to flow. And they eventually flowed in 2019, so I was happy to see that. But, you know, if I had my FCM colleagues around the table, even those that sit on the board today, you know, they'd be sitting here talking about the story of municipalities being left to their own devices for a period of 30 years. Steve Pomeroy was at our last meeting, and he highlighted through 3 consecutive administrations, there was $4 billion invested in the housing sector. Most of that flowed through to the nonprofit sector. That's a period of 25 years. Our government, as you know, through the National Housing Strategy has now, we're probably near the 100 billion mark in a period of 5 years. So a lot has changed. And I think we, to be that constructive critic, I still think we need to do a lot more from a financial perspective to invest in the non-market area. But if my FCM colleagues were here, they would talk about some of our provincial partners not being at the table. And the federal government can't do it alone. And so can I get your idea in your comments in terms of how we deal with those provincial partners that aren't at the table? Some of your work talks about, and you referenced it today, all 3 levels of government need to be working on this issue. We don't need finger pointing, but it's no secret that there are a number of provinces that aren't investing in affordable housing. I live in a province where that's the case. I can point to others that are laggards in terms of Manitoba. That's probably soon to change. Saskatchewan, I think, is a great example in terms of looking for affordable housing programs there. What do we do with our provincial partners when we need all 3 levels of government at the table and we only have 2?
Right. Well, it's a really great question, and I think it is the multi-billion-dollar question. Through my work as a federal housing advocate, we're focusing a lot of our files in different geographic regions so that we can build relationships with the provincial government and to have these conversations. Now, the provinces did agree to the principles of the human right to housing through the bilateral agreements. There is, you know, there's been something in the, I think it was the Globe, who went around asking the provinces around the, you know, what they felt about the human right to housing, and a lot didn't understand what that meant, or they're worried that it will result in them getting sued. But in understanding what that means, it also means that, you know, they're investing in outcomes for people, and anyone who gets involved in government and in politics has that at the heart of their intentions. They want to see real change for the people that they serve. So it's to have these discussions in a way that doesn't end up being turf wars. But on the other hand, the federal government being involved at this, you know, at this level for the first time in a very long time, there needs to be strings attached. But it is about building these fences, having coordination. My call for a comprehensive encampments response plan by August 31st is an example of getting all the players at the table and having a coordinated approach and not piecemeal and not one behind another. I understand why provinces sometimes come out being very upset, and it's not just about turf war, but it is about proper consultation. And, you know, every region is different. I come from the land of libertarians. I grew up in Alberta, and so the politics there is very different. But it is about, you know, if I talk about having meaningful relationships with people with lived experience to get to real solutions, the meaningful relationships need to exist across the board. That means me to you as government. That means between all levels of government as well.
Okay. Your last report, as you just referenced, was on encampments, and that's something that really exploded through the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic. Our budget, as you know, has $250 million earmarked towards encampments. We hope that that will be cost shared with the provincial and territorial governments to address the whole issue of encampments. We topped up our Reaching Home program. As you know, there was a lot of consternation with municipalities across the country who thought that that fund was going to be reduced, and in fact, that's quite the opposite. We've not just topped it up, but we've provided a little bit more resources, and of course, our bilateral agreements also speak to addressing encampments as well. And so I can point to 3 distinct pots of money that go a long way to addressing encampments. Can you comment on the need for the resources that we have in Reaching Home, in our new encampment fund, in the bilateral agreements, and some of the other funds that we have that address people who are living rough on our streets?
Absolutely. Well, we saw in Budget 24 there was a lot of new initiatives and then continued initiatives, which is very positive. One thing that I'm hearing back from all the sectors is that investment can't fall off the cliff. And, if it's just injection, eye drop by drop, organizations that do this work on the ground can't hire and maintain staff and then build trust with people with lived experience and get the results that we want, and which is to have people under an adequate roof, that are adequately housed, not just sheltered, but housed. That's the end goal for everyone, and that has to, that will get us, so that when people are talking about their frustration of walking past encampments, that, people don't want to see encampments, but it's not just about pushing them further along out of the sight of the public view. It is about having, investing in people. And to invest in people is also to invest in the non-market sector, because, again, over the past 30 years, the levels of government that have been investing in non-market housing, which is very little, has been drop by drop. And therefore, we've lost the capacity. John Gordon has spoken about that also in the Indigenous housing sector. So we need 30 years of promises of continued funding. Quebec is a great example until the last, I would say, 5 to 6 years that had invested in their non-market sector. André Castonguay was here last week to speak about that and how important that is, and I'm sure Véronique Laflamme will be speaking about that. So it's not just about money for construction.
Thank you, Ms. Wu. Okay. You can follow up at another question. Madame Chabot, pour 6 minutes.
Merci. 6 minutes for Ms. Chabot. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ms. Houle, the defender of housing. Your contribution is very important in what we're going through at the moment in Canada and in Quebec in terms of the housing crisis. We've been hearing a lot about it. This isn't the first study on this topic either at this committee. We need to see how we can act, what to do, what measures are the right ones. If we can't fix the crisis in the short term, at least ensure that the effects are alleviated, because you're right, it is a right. Thank you also for your contribution with important reports. Here we had adopted some of the recommendations that also came up in your report. The challenge is how long it takes to get to concrete results. And aside from there's also your annual report on encampments. I have a question about that. I think you raised the alarm, a strong alarm with that report. We're trying to prevent homelessness here also. When we talk about encampments, you were asking for a plan by August 2024 from the federal government. Has the government responded to your report? Yes. I obtained a letter from the housing minister, and I met with them last night. We were told that there are other things, in addition to the $250 million fund that will be put in place. It's quite ambitious on our part to ask for a plan by August 31st, 2024, but it's something that's important for the people who are going through that situation, and you need deadlines. August 31st, why August 31st? Well, that's because that's when municipalities start talking about what we're going to do or what they're going to do with people in those encampments during the winter. We don't want to see people losing their lives or limbs, arms, legs, fingers, because of the cold. It's an urgent issue. It's not just shelter, it's housing and real solutions we're talking about. In one of your recommendations, you also asked for Infrastructure Canada and CMHC to include funding agreements with the provinces and territories that would meet the international obligations that Canada has, international and national obligations in terms of human rights. What would that mean to you? What would that look like to you, a strong engagement and commitment to infrastructure? Well, we heard that there are a lot of actors on the market saying that they are for human rights. So I can clarify what a human right is. Adequate housing is not just affordability, but housing must also be accessible for people with all levels of ability. And also there must be eviction protections, and they must be clean, equipped with the required services such as clean water and electricity, and need to be culturally appropriate also, where people have access to job opportunities and community resources. The right to housing doesn't mean that the government must give everybody housing, adequate housing to every single person, but what it means for government is to use its power and resources, its authority, to create a housing system that will support the right to housing for everybody. It means investing as many available resources as possible, using rules and regulations, and taking active measures. It also means setting goals, such as reducing and eliminating homelessness, and designating and creating, rather, programs that lead to progress that is measurable towards these goals. It also means acting quickly to protect and support those with the biggest needs and eliminating discrimination. So the current system in Canada does not meet these definitions. The housing crisis has been here for 30 years now. It took 30 years to get here. It's not something we're going to solve in a day, but we absolutely need all levels of government to work together to make progress. So we need a plan. Well, we need a plan. The National Housing Strategy was supposed to be helpful for that. $82 billion were earmarked in the initial strategy, but we can see that it didn't lead to all the results we wanted. It's public money, where I would say that I won't say a very tiny portion, but, a small portion, less than we would have thought, has been allocated towards affordable housing. And there's also something else that's troubling, is in terms of it states that in the strategy that in order for homelessness, chronic homelessness, to be reduced by 50% by 2030, we would need $3.5 billion invested each year. What do you think of this conclusion? Thank you, Ms. Chabot. I'm sure you'll have an opinion to give me in my next 2 minutes. Yes, indeed.
Monsieur Boulouris, pour 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, monsieur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ms. Hull, for being here with us this morning, and thank you also for all the work you and your team have done. It's very important work. To start, I want to talk a little bit about the housing stock and commercialization and housing in general. Your office recently published a report on financing. Your CMHC, it was you. Yes, okay, I just wanted to make sure I had the right people doing the right things. So since the 90s, we've seen that the government has stopped investing in truly affordable housing, and we really saw the switch to thinking of housing as an investment. For example, people who don't have a pension will invest in housing, because for them it's a way to set aside money for when, they need it later. But there are also large corporations that own huge lots, huge towers, thousands of units. So what is the impact of this abandonment by the federal government and also the commercialization of the housing stock? Well, what it means is that rents are not affordable at all. It also means that there are very aggressive activities to try to evict people who are supposed to be protected by local laws so that rents can be increased further. We know that these buildings that we're talking about, those, for example, that were great for speculation or well-placed, were those that were used for people with low-income housing, and that's why rents were lower. So there was a lot of margin to increase those rents and profits once these units were empty. There's no control, rent controls once the unit is vacant. Quebec is starting to look at that, but things aren't quite there yet. So that was a great reason for evicting people. So what we've seen is evicting people and also aggressive purchasing. Perhaps these were old buildings. They needed to be renovated. But those buildings were the result of federal investments in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And now we want to continue to incentivize the private market to continue building housing. We have an acquisition fund, which is great for non-market units to buy them. That's great. But the private market will be able to make profits a second time. So why not spend that investment directly in non-market units? So that's something I really wanted to bring to your attention today. Perfect. Many people say that one of the current problems we're seeing in the housing crisis in Quebec and in Canada is the lack of offer. If there is more housing, things will get better. What type of housing? Building condos at $2 million, well, it will increase the number of units, but is it really going to help people who are about to get evicted, who can't pay their rents, who have to change neighborhoods and even cities sometimes? Well, as I said at the beginning, you need the right types of units. When you look at CMHC, talking about the housing system and building whatever we want compared to what we need, that's what they're looking at. So we have Dr. Caroline Whitman, who's issued a report determining that there is an extreme need in Canada for affordable housing. 20% of housing need to be offered with rents under $1,500 per month. All programs need to be adjusted to make sure that those needs are being met. There are differences between regions, between cities, but based on basic need rather than, what the ask is, we'll get there. But if we continue to just base ourselves on what people are looking for, that would be better than, rather than focusing on what the private market wants to build because that's what they want to do. That's not going to work. The housing market works for maybe 80% of people, but for the 20% of people for whom it doesn't work, the results are awful. Well, for encampments, we've seen people also live in their cars because they can no longer afford rent. I have 1 minute left to my first turn, but complex question. What's the federal government's role in all that? It's complicated. There are cities, provinces, municipalities, the federal government. Often we are waiting for partners to get on board, and that can take a long time. Well, first of all, you need intent, clear intent, goals, for example, investing in a generation, so a 30-year plan to build good relationships. Of course, housing is an issue that falls under the provinces, especially, but all three levels of government have a role to play. And the federal government needs to set the vision. So it has a huge responsibility in being a leader in terms of human rights. Thank you, Mr. Boulris.
Ms. Ferrari for 5.
Thank you so much, Chair, and thank you, Ms. Houle. It's wonderful to have you here. Very important work, as all of my colleagues have said here today. Ms. Houle, we had Mr. Kevin Lee here. He's the Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian Home Builders Association. He testified, and his testimony was very powerful, in my opinion. He said, "I'm here to tell you that you will never fix the affordable housing issue with funding alone. There are simply not enough tax dollars to go around. If you don't fix housing affordability, you can never fix your social housing problems. If you don't fix housing affordability, people can't buy homes, and that puts pressure on the rental housing stock." I see you nodding in agreement, so I would assume you agree with that kind of statement. But when we talk about, I had the chance to visit the Royal Hospital this past week. They have 240 beds. This is a mental health facility and research facility. And the manager there told me, she said, "Michelle, if I have one message for you," she said, "it's that we do not have access for supportive housing." So she said, "I know it sounds terrible," but she said, "ultimately, these beds don't get freed up." So when you walk by encampments, when you look at people who are truly struggling, there's an interaction there of mental illness. Our emergency rooms for, my community of Peterborough, this is one of the big issues. There's nowhere for people to go. And it's not just housing. It's housing with supports for people who have that complexity. And it's all connected because, to your point today, I take your housing advocate position seriously, but there has to be an accountability factor on the federal government. And, you can't manage anything that you don't mention. And the reality is we keep taxing people, we keep taxing home builders, we keep putting on these costs, and people aren't able to build, which opens up the housing continuum. So my question to you is, I guess as the federal housing advocate, the department spent $1.36 billion between 2019 and 2021, but the Auditor General said the department did not know whether chronic homelessness and homelessness had increased or decreased since 2019 as a result of this investment. How do we ensure that this money, this billions of dollars, is being spent so that we have less encampments and less people who need housing are actually getting housing?
Well, thank you for that question. Now, we need measurable results. We need transparency around these funds, and I spoke about public dollars for public good. And this is exactly what we're talking about. And when we talk about the definition of adequate housing, some people really is adequately housed means being housed with supports. And for some people, it's just a light touch, learning the rights and responsibilities, how to be a good neighbor, how to get a banking account, and being able to pay their rent every month. And some people need a lot more supports. And supports for mental health, for addiction, and it is about housing first. There is no housing first without housing, however. So there is a supply issue, but it is about the right kind of supply. But what I'm talking about, and I've mentioned during my opening statement, is that we need measurable results, we need transparency, we need data. And the non-market housing has provided all of that all along since its investment started 60 years ago. So we need to have those accountability mechanisms in place for the entire housing system to truly be able to understand. As Carolyn Witzman says, we can't count what we don't know, and we can't address what we're not counting.
Exactly. And so I guess to that point, I guess what I'm looking for, and what you say in these testimonies is really what's put in the committee report that goes back to the House that we hopefully evaluate. But speaking to reporters at a press conference on Parliament Hill, the Auditor General said the government really doesn't know if all the housing-related money spent so far, about $4.5 billion across 6 different programs, which is, a lot of the homelessness issue. And when you say transparency and accountability, on the record, I guess what I'm asking you is it doesn't feel like that's in place right now by the federal government and the current government in charge. It doesn't feel like that because obviously things have never been worse. Rent has never been this high. We've never seen these encampments. How do you make sure that there's accountability and measurable results, that the money's actually helping people? What can we do?
Well, first of all, we do need an all-of-government approach, and bringing together different silos. So you talked about health. You talked about, housing and other areas. This, it needs to be not just all levels of government, but an all-of-government approach to be able to understand fully of what's happening. I mean, we're in the data age, but are we collecting good data? And then, there's other laws around privacy who say we can't share that information because. But there's a lot of opportunities there.
Sorry. Thank you.
Mr. Fregas-Catos for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for being here again. It's good to see you. You mentioned in your testimony at the outset, among other things, public land and how that could be part of the solution. It can make a meaningful contribution to the challenges at hand. Can you expand on that?
Absolutely. Sometimes some of the, when we're talking about housing and supply and the economy, it's not just a simple question of supply and demand because there is a supply that is finite, which is land. And land sometimes contributes, especially in a larger city, the big cost factor involved in building new housing. So, government is sitting on a wealth of land, and land that some of it can be developed for housing. It's not about selling it to the highest bidder and then government no longer having access to that resource in the future, but land leases. And exploring the role of land trusts, community land trusts, so community actors for the community good to ensure that this land has value in perpetuity and not just sold off to speculation. So I think it's an amazing opportunity. I'm glad to see it being leveraged. I also hear that it's quite complicated, but that it is happening because to say something's complicated, it's going to take time is not a reason not to do it because we need to do it.
I was about to ask you on your thoughts on the government deciding to emphasize leasing versus selling the land, but you've answered that. I do want to ask you also about co-op housing. Just a few days ago, you would have seen the government made the single largest investment in the past 30 years to see more co-op homes built. What do you think of co-op housing in terms of its again, contribution to this crisis?
Co-op housing builds community as well as housing that is affordable, not just for people with deep subsidies, but for people who live there. And they will realize a deeper affordability for those who don't receive subsidies as time goes on. And there's reports from Cooperative Housing Federation of Canada that proves this. And so co-ops really are a great thing. What co-ops need and the entire non-market housing needs as well as capital dollars to build and acquire more is change in legislation to be able to leverage their own assets in order to not just be dependent on government funds. They need support from government in order to bolster the capacity. Because right now we're sitting on a few narratives that are very worrisome for me. First of all, that non-market housing, especially, including co-ops, are only there or should be supported only because they house people the private market will not and cannot house. That's not true. And, non-market housing should be available to everyone, and that it has its role in the private market or in the overall market to compete with the private market. That these are not ghettos and warehouses for poor people or people with deep needs. First of all. Second of all, that only the private market has the capital and the capacity to build. The non-market housing sector used to have a ton of capacity in the same way that Indigenous housing had a lot of capacity. That has dwindled because there's not been proper government investment in the sector, and so anyone who does have talent has moved to work in the private market. We need to bring these people back, and we have a lot of examples again in Quebec of organizations that are brilliant. They have the business acumen, and they are there to build community wealth. We need to see that culture happening in all the provinces, and Mr. Collins talked about Manitoba, not having a lot of non-market housing. I know that Manitoba is struggling with their capacity. You can dump all the capital there, but if no one can do it, then that's where you need the support as well.
I know you obviously have a passion on co-op housing in particular, and that shows for very good reason. We have a colleague who talks a lot about housing, but when he talks about co-op housing, he talks about it as, quote, Soviet-style housing. How do you think that message, what do you think of that message? I mean, that kind of negativity.
I think it's a real shame, and I invite everyone to go visit a housing co-op, and they'll see something very different.
Finally, the government has proposed capital gains tax changes. The revenues gained from that will go to, among other things, helping on the housing side. What do you think of this particular measure?
As I outlined, the human right to housing puts a responsibility on governments to use regulation and mechanisms to be able to, realize the human right to housing to everyone in Canada without discrimination, and that includes creating market conditions so that to decrease speculation. Now, I've sat with this committee last year about financialization and showed what the harm that financialization does. Financialization meaning that it's the large corporate investors. But as the large corporate investors set the rates for rentals, all the mom and pops also follow suit. So it has a rippling effect on everyone who is renting, for example. So, as government, you have the responsibility to put in regulations to shape the housing market so that it protects the human right to housing for everyone.
Thank you, Mr. Fregus-Keros. Madame Chabot, pour 2 minutes et 30. Madame.
Merci. Thank you. My question was too long on homelessness last time, but in terms of homelessness still, it's concerning to see that even if there are investments in the next budget, we're still not going to make good progress because we need everybody's political will to put not just money towards that issue. It's really to help people get out of homelessness, to actually give them a roof or at least services that will be significant. My question is about for measures to speed things up, because there is a certain amount of willingness to provide non-market units. In Quebec, we have an ecosystem that allows for that to be developed. We have a lot of different organisms. We have nonprofit organizations. Should we not move more quickly? As soon as we have a common objective, transfer the funding as quickly as possible so that we can act, for example, in Quebec. Absolutely. It really is a question of time. We are in a crisis. The results are that people are dying in encampments. And speculation is continuing at the same time, and financialization of housing is continuing also. As I stated, we of course need to not just put money into housing, but also into supporting a system that will ensure that the non-market sector has the ability to develop in order to really be able to seize the opportunities. When talking about collaboration with the provinces, we know that the federal government has its role to play. There are investments, and it's great to decide to reinvest money. Now it's time to act. But to ensure that everybody's got the same objective, would a summit help, for example, on the housing crisis in order to continue the dialogue? We saw that kind of a summit for auto thefts. I think that's the kind of issue that we need to act with the same objective in mind. Would something like that create the momentum that we would need to act? I'm not really in the position to act, but if we were to hold such a summit, we would need a solid framework with solid goals. As I mentioned, the system right now, the way it works, is very profitable for a lot of people. So thank you, Mr. Ms. Chabot, Mr. Boulris, you have just over a minute 30. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Ms. Hull, I have a question. I'll ask you to answer with yes or no, if possible, based on your experience, and everything you've done. Are temporary immigrants responsible for the housing crisis? No. Thank you. You heard my colleague from the Liberal Party talk about cooperative housing. I'm going to share your enthusiasm for them. In my riding, Rosemont La Petite Patrie, there are some there, and they are great. They're very democratic. There's participation of all the people who live there. But they do have problems sometimes with, for example, being able to do renovations. For example, 30 years ago, they might have been built well, but now there are things that need to be upgraded, and they don't always have the money in order to make the upgrades that are needed. I'm giving you the example of cooperatives, but really it can be for anybody. It's to be able to, over time, make sure that we can continue to access this housing. Well, in terms of the conditions for the co-ops can help, for example, to have a reserve fund. The federal programs in the 1980s had fewer conditions. The new co-ops being built now do require a certain percentage to go to a reserve fund that will address that kind of problem. And for example, fixing things over time. People who live there over time invest little by little so that and the federal government and other governments need to help that to contribute also for large renovations, not just, the elevator not working or the roof or something like that. So you need conditions also in addition to funding. Well, we've seen numbers that say that for every affordable housing unit we build, we're losing 10 or 11 of them. It's like we're trying to dig our way out of the hole, but we're just digging further down. What can we do in terms of investments to reverse that situation? Well, first of all, you do need to invest into the sector, but also have regulation in place to control or stop speculation. Thank you. 10 seconds. No, I'm all right.
Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Boulris.
Conclude with 2.5 minutes with Ms. Falk and 2.5 with Mr. Collins. Ms. Falk, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for being here today. We know that Canadians are in an affordability crisis. Everything seems to be going up, and this also reflects within housing, right? Because the materials that are needed also go up. In April, 70% of the provinces had asked to have a meeting because of the carbon tax increase by the federal government, and that meeting request was not met. So in my mind, it begs the question of how many other things do provinces want to have meaningful conversation or consultation with the federal government, and they don't show up, or they do what they want anyway. We know that wraparound services, which I believe are very important, and that's what we need, to be delivered in all of our provinces in a way that works cohesively within all levels of government, right? You have your municipal who are there on the ground that knows what's going on. You have your provinces who are the ones that are supposed to be distributing these funds, and the federal government that's supposed to be there to support if and when needed. So if we don't have the ability to fund provinces where they need help with wraparound services, for example. I mean, Canadians are now spending more servicing the debt in this nation than the provinces are receiving in healthcare transfers. I mean, I see that as money that could be used for wraparound services, that servicing debt money that could be used for wraparound services. Would you agree with that statement?
I'm sorry, you've caught me deer in headlights. I am not in a position to...
Wraparound services are important, correct?
Absolutely,
which you've stated.
they
and
are.
We need those to be able to give a hand up to those people and that need housing, right? That need housing. And as you mentioned, it's on a continuum, right? Sometimes it's a little bit more complicated or it's sometimes a little bit easier with just, like you said, setting up a bank account, that type of thing. So would you agree that with the amount of money Canadians, taxpayers, are spending on servicing debt, that money that's being used to service and pay interest payments on the debt that the Trudeau government has spent could be used to help people in those wraparound services that are needed?
I'm not in any position to even comment on how tax is done in Canada. That's
So you
not
don't
my
believe
area
that
of-
that money that's being spent on interest could be used to help with wraparound services?
Thank you, Ms. Falk. Your time is
Okay,
over.
thank you.
Mr. Collins for 2.5 minutes to conclude this hour.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I guess my first question is a simple one. You know, I think any federal housing plan, apart from, let's take the politics out of it in terms of the partisanship, but any serious housing plan should have affordable housing as its priority, encampments as its priority. Do you agree with those statements in terms of providing support in those areas?
As Canada's first federal housing advocate that is here to push government to uphold the human right to housing, those were my two areas of priority, absolutely. There's a lot of other systemic issues at hand, but those are the big ones, so yes.
You talked about doubling the stock, and of course of non-market housing, and of course the federal government's not responsible for and in charge of building new supply. Municipalities and the provinces primarily are in charge of that. But do you think it's important, as we try to incentivize new supply and new non-market units, that we work with our municipal partners?
Absolutely, yeah. It's all three levels of government, because you also need provincial funding as well, and the provincial funding for, you know, much needed wraparound services for supportive housing too.
Okay. Quick question about encampments. Coming out of the pandemic, you know, we're dealing with supply chain issues, we're dealing with an opioid crisis, we're dealing with mental health crisis, we're dealing with inflation, and so many municipalities are struggling to address the encampment issue. And I read your report twice now. Can I ask the traditional providers, sorry, I think would look at your report and ask the question about how they should be looking at providing those services on a go-forward basis. So you've talked about the whole issue of partners. We have a traditional men's and women's shelter system that don't accommodate couples that make their way into the emergency system. Pets is an issue. It's become an issue with encampments. Many people say they're in encampment because they have a pet and they don't want to visit the emergency shelter. The drug use policies vary. You know, we were able to accommodate these issues prior to the pandemic. Now, coming out of the pandemic, these are some of the barriers that force people to live on the street rather than find those services from a traditional provider. What advice do you have for emergency shelter providers as it relates to changing their business model to accommodate?
It's a complex issue. We need change to meet the needs and to consult with people who use these services to know how best to meet their needs. Short answer.
Thank you, Mr. Collins. This concludes the first hour, and I want to thank you, Madame Ulha, for you had the full hour to present to this committee and address the members' concerns and questions. So thank you for appearing again. And with that, we'll suspend for 2 minutes while we transition to the next witness list. Suspend.
We'll set up a time to get together.
committee members. We will now begin the second hour of the committee's study on housing, and welcome witnesses from the Front d'Action Populaire et Réagement Urbain, Véronique Laflamme, spokesperson from the Independent Contractors and Business Association of British Columbia. We have Jock Finlayson, Chief Economist. And from Abundant Housing Vancouver, we have Daniel Oleksiuk. Welcome to the committee. You will each have 5 minutes for an opening statement, and we'll begin with Madame Laflamme. Madame, you have 5 minutes.
Bonjour.
Good morning.
Donc, le recensement de 2021 montre que plus de 1,6 million de ménages locataires canadiens consacraient déjà alors plus de la norme de 30% de leurs revenus pour se loger.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
620 d'entre eux y engouffraient plus de 50%.
Madame Laflamme,
Translation is not working.
there's no translation. And Madame Laflamme, you begin again. Could you just speak a little more slowly?
Yeah. On recommence?
Starting over? Okay. Good morning, Mr. Chair. The 2021 census shows that 1.6 million Canadian renter households were already spending more than the standard 30% of their income on housing, with 620,000 of them spending more than 50% of to the detriment of their other needs. In Quebec, 373,000 renter households are in this situation with a modest median annual income of less than $24,000. Many have probably become homeless since. The situation is probably much worse since these figures are based on 2020 income temporarily inflated incomes rather by special income supports. There are many also who may not be reflected in these statistics, as people experiencing homelessness or with precarious and migratory status are not included in the census. Quebec and all the provinces are currently experiencing a rental housing shortage, the worst we've seen in 15 years in Quebec and the worst we've seen in the province. In this context, rents are rising even faster, discrimination is increasing, and rents for the few apartments available for rent are much higher due to lack of rent controls. Despite the acute affordable housing stock is rapidly eroding, and the residential insecurity is now affecting more and more tenant households. Despite the acuteness of the shortage by the scale of its consequences, the current crisis experienced by tenants cannot be summarized simply by scarcity alone. High rents and their inadequacy to the incomes of a large proportion of the tenants also represents a crisis. Rental housing built in the recent years, often by giants in the industry, has increased this unaffordability. However, there are very few alternatives because the private sector holds 90% of the rental stock in Quebec, and it's probably more in the rest of the country. In Quebec, various supports, for example, but the lack of co-op housing and others increases this problem. Already, the UN Housing Group stated that there was a huge problem in Canada. The impacts of this private sector has a serious impact and